I'm John Mackenzie. Coming up on Football Today.
Roman Abramovich says he wants to turn Chelsea's stadium into a cathedral of football.
They may have won the league, but in terms of ground size, Chelsea are very much mid-table. Stamford Bridge currently holds around 42,000 people. They want to up that to 60,000 with those ambitious plans.
Chelsea Football Club just released a statement on their website announcing that their new stadium project has been put on hold. It's a very short statement saying no further pre-construction, design and planning will occur. The club does not have a time frame set for reconsideration of its decision. The decision was made due to the current unfavourable investment climate.
3 years ago, there was an air of expectancy around Chelsea Football Club. Having fallen behind in the Matchday revenue tables, they had just been granted approval to build a new stadium on the Fulham Road plot on which Stamford Bridge is situated. Fast forward to the present, and that planning agreement is set to expire imminently, with no indication that the club will implement it. In this episode, we ask, why have Chelsea undergone an about turn with regards to their new stadium plans?
So in January 2017, representatives from Chelsea and from the stadium project team gathered at Hammersmith Town Hall for a meeting of Hammersmith and Fulham Council's planning committee.
Liam Twomey covers Chelsea Football Club for The Athletic.
It lasted just over 3 hours. There were speakers for and against the Stamford Bridge redevelopment. But there was always optimism on behalf of the club that they would get the approval they needed, and in the end it was unanimous. It was clear that Hammersmith and Fulham Council thought this would be a big benefit to the borough as well as a big benefit to Chelsea. And the mood at the end of the meeting was jubilant. There was a real feeling that by the next decade, Chelsea would be moving into a new home befitting a modern European super club.
3 years later, though, things are looking a little less positive. The work on the stadium hasn't begun yet, and the planning approval is set to expire in 2 months without the possibility of an extension. What's going on?
Well, the project is on hold, and Chelsea as a club are on hold. The statement they issued in May 2018, the very brief, abrupt statement saying that the project had been paused due to an unfavourable investment climate, fittingly sort of vague reasoning. It was clearly partly down to the owner Roman Abramovich's visa issues and partly down to the spiralling costs of the project, an initial estimate of £500 million to around £1 billion. And nothing has moved on since then. If you ask anyone at Chelsea now, the line remains the same. It is paused. There is no timetable for it to be resumed. And if the planning approval deadline expires on March 31st, if Chelsea have not done anything by then they will have to apply all over again.
You mentioned in your piece that it's not even that the building work needs to start happening before the proposal expires. Simply, you need to fill in a form which says we are going to start doing work at this point. There's no sense that that's going to happen at all then?
There really isn't any sense that anything is going to happen with this project anytime soon. They only have to file paperwork, sort of notice of knocking down a wall rather than actually knocking it down. But there's no sense that that is going to happen. The first phase of this project was always going to be knocking down the Millennium and Copthorne hotels outside Stamford Bridge and the health club and the other buildings that go around the stadium. And there's no sense that that is about to happen, particularly in the midst of a busy season. But unless Chelsea at least file notice of when they're going to do that, they will be set back in this project. And as much as they are confident that planning approval wouldn't be a massive problem second time around, it would clearly be a significant step back for the club.
Chelsea have announced they have scrapped plans for their £1 billion new stadium at Stamford Bridge because of, quote,
let's read it together,
an unfavourable investment climate.
Yeah, I'm sure it's that, yeah.
You've mentioned that the club cited unfavourable investment climate as their reason why they were shelving these plans. And you mentioned again that it wouldn't be the most difficult thing in the world for them to actually renegotiate an approval later down the line. Do you think there's some sense in which they are going to wait until perhaps the British economic forecast looks a little bit more positive. Do you get the sense that this is more them just stalling?
Well, the uncertainty arising from the Brexit vote was certainly in the background. And now, of course, we know that Britain has left the European Union. That may impact things positively in Chelsea's favour. It's clear that Roman Abramovich is seeking some sort of outside funding for this project. He's not going to pay for it solely out of his own pocket. Whether that comes in the form of bank loans or third-party investment is yet to be determined. It's possible that Chelsea could certainly revisit this when they feel that it's financially more agreeable. But you do get the sense that there isn't really a solid plan at this point. And the uncertainty, I think, is what's most worrying for Chelsea fans, because it's fair to question at this point whether the stadium will ever happen.
You've mentioned Roman Abramovich being a factor in perhaps some of the reasons why there's been some foot dragging on this. How much of this do you think comes down to the visa difficulties that Abramovich has had? Would you expect the timeline to have been more accelerated if he felt more welcome in London, for example?
The visa difficulties are a big part of this. Abramovich has not reapplied for a Tier 1 investor visa since withdrawing his application in the spring of 2018. And when you talk to people who know him, people at Chelsea who report directly to him, the message is clear that why would he personally bankroll a potential £1 billion construction project in a city that he's not welcome to visit? Now, clearly he has Israeli citizenship, he has the right to come to the UK on an Israeli passport, but as far as we know, he has not elected to do that so far since all of this really blew up. So that is certainly a big part of this. And unless the political situation changes, it might be a little bit of a surprise if anything changes in Abramovich's attitude.
It now looks as if Chelsea Football Club's plan to build a new stadium at Battersea Power Station won't go ahead. The club today lost out to a rival bid for the site.
I'm sure a lot of people will remember that 8 years ago now the club was outbid on Battersea Power Station as a potential home. Do you think it's out of the question that a big move away from the Fulham Road site could happen in the future?
Well, nothing is completely out of the question, but the way things stand, it is unfeasible for Chelsea to play anywhere other than Stamford Bridge as their permanent home, because there's an unusual situation where the freehold to the stadium and actually the name Chelsea FC is owned by a supporter-led group called Chelsea Pitch Owners, CPO. And that was done in the 1990s because it was an attempt to protect the club. At that point, there were several property developers interested in buying Stamford Bridge and obviously redeveloping it as properties. And Chelsea, to protect the long-term home of the club, created this supporters organisation to make sure that no one could ever take them away from their historic home without their approval ever again. And that has been a problem for Abramovich. He tried to drive a vote to basically dissolve the CPO in 2011, around the time that Chelsea were bidding for Battersea Power Station, because he knew that without dissolving CPO and getting control of the freehold himself, he couldn't sell Stamford Bridge, and therefore it would be completely unfeasible for Chelsea to move elsewhere. And of course, they couldn't call themselves Chelsea anywhere else. So that situation is the same as it was in 2011 when Chelsea lost that vote. They fell short of the 75% majority that they needed, and CPO remain totally opposed to Chelsea calling anywhere other than Stamford Bridge their permanent home.
But obviously, staying in the Fulham Road site does raise a few logistical issues. Could you tell us about some of the difficulties that arise by keeping the stadium in its current place?
Well, until Chelsea lost that CPO vote in 2011, the official stance of the club's hierarchy was that redeveloping Stamford Bridge was unfeasible. And when you look at the detail of the plans that they've drawn up since, it's easy to see why, because there's a different level of complexity to this project to what Tottenham had to go through, to what Arsenal had to go through with their new stadium. Chelsea are hemmed in on two sides by rail lines. There is a cemetery nearby. They are limited by Fulham Road as well. So they can't really build out in terms of a new stadium. They cannot make the stadium bigger outwards. They have to dig down. So the plans were for the pitch to be actually below ground level and build up. But there are actually limits on how high they can build up as well. So they were really, really squeezed to fit 60,000 seats into that space, and they had to get very creative architecturally, including decking over the rail lines, which in practice, construction-wise, would be very, very difficult to do. You're talking about getting heavy machinery and trade vehicles in and out of Fulham Road, which is already a very busy road. It's basically the only point of access to the site. You would have limitations on drilling to avoid disturbing the cemetery nearby. You would have limitations on construction work when Network Rail is operational and the tube is operational. So there are all sorts of logistical difficulties to this stadium that you just don't get with a regular site.
So what do you think is the likelihood then that Chelsea will be playing in a new stadium within the present decade? It sounds like it could be fairly unlikely.
I think it does now look unlikely that Chelsea will be in a new stadium by the end of the 2020s. If you look at the original plans for the Stamford Bridge redevelopment, Chelsea, around the time they got planning approval, conceded that they would have to spend 4 years away, which is a huge amount of time. That's more than double the amount of time that Tottenham spent away while their new stadium was being built. As we know with all of these things, in reality, they tend to run longer than you expect them to, and especially with a construction project as complex as this, you could be talking about 5-6 years away. And Chelsea, if they let planning approval lapse, haven't even crossed the first step on that process. So I think this could easily be a 10-year process to get a new stadium, if they even are serious about resuming it anytime soon.
Chelsea have decided that a new stadium is not a priority as the club head into a new decade. But elsewhere in the Premier League, stadium rebuilds and extensions are happening with ever-increasing frequency. What do their rivals know that Chelsea don't?
They have 3 income streams in the main: broadcast, commercial and matchday.
Kieran Maguire is a football finance expert working at Liverpool University and co-host of the Price of Football podcast.
Broadcast, to a certain extent, is agreed centrally by the Premier League and by UEFA. So therefore, they can't get incremental income compared to other clubs. Commercial, you've got your front of shirt sponsorship and your sleeve sponsorship and perimeter advertising. And Chelsea do well there, but not spectacularly. So therefore, Matchday is the one thing which you can control and you can leverage on as well. If you take a look at the market at present, we have Manchester United with a capacity of 76,000. We have Liverpool at 54, aiming to go to 60. Spurs are at 62. West Ham are at 60, aiming to go to 62. Arsenal are at just over 60. And then Chelsea are at 41. Now, Manchester United generated £111 million last year from matchday income. Chelsea were at 66, so they're almost £50 million behind. Spurs last year were mainly at Wembley. They generated 71 million, but you can add on 30 million pounds. So in the environment in which we're presently operating, Chelsea could easily find themselves at the start of each season being 40 million pounds behind their peer group in terms of its ability as a club to generate matchday income. That's quite a considerable shortfall. It's not insurmountable, given they've got Roman Abramovich behind them, but I think it does put them at a disadvantage in the financial fair play environment as well.
Arsenal Football Club, one of the most historic and successful clubs in Europe, needed a new home.
Arsenal's problem in the 1990 was that post the Taylor report on safety in sports grounds, their capacity had been cut from well over 50,000 down to 38,000. And that's despite the building of 2 new stands in the east and the west. And their corporate facilities were falling behind some of the other major clubs.
Let's take a step back in time. I think there's a sort of received wisdom about stadium rebuilds that goes back to the construction of the Emirates. The logic there seems to be that Arsenal lost out in building the Emirates because they built their stadium just before television revenues boomed, outstripping matchday revenue. The argument seems to go that, well, it didn't really matter whatever you made on top of your usual matchday revenue by extending the stadium. It was going to pale into insignificance against those TV revenues. Do you agree with that version of the history?
There's an element of truth in it. But if you take a look at Chelsea's peer group, and we often talk about this phrase marginal gains, 19% of Spurs' income comes from Matchday, 19% of Arsenal's, 19% of Manchester United's, 18% of Liverpool's, 15% for Chelsea. So they are behind the curve. That is something which can be overcome, but it just makes the manager's task that much more difficult. The way that Chelsea address that is that they do have a recruitment and sale model, which involves effectively the factory farm approach of young players, and then looking to move those on at a profit, and by having huge sums of players out on loan. FIFA are going to potentially address that particular issue by restricting the number of players that clubs can have out on loan. So Chelsea look to lose further income, which they presently generate. And as I said before, if you start off the season 40 or 50 million pounds behind other clubs, then that makes your job as a club that wants to qualify for the Champions League, wants to be winning trophies, that much more difficult. And there's only 4 clubs that can get into the Champions League. And we now have 6 who, in theory, I think Arsenal are set for a fallow period myself, 6 who are in theory are competing for those 4 places at the start of the season.
Do you think that an argument could be made that Arsenal were a little bit too far ahead of the curve in terms of their stadium rebuild? That they realised that a new stadium was important, but they didn't quite realise how to go about doing that? Because it feels very much as if they had built a new stadium now, they might have done it slightly differently in the sort of Spurs model with all of those various commercial interests that you can attach to something like a stadium now.
Yeah, I think there have been significant changes in the construction industry in terms of connectivity at grounds, and also in terms of, it's a horrible phrase, but it is used these days, the matchday experience. Arsenal still came from the environment where fans would turn up at a football stadium as close to kick-off as possible and leave straight afterwards. The model which has been adopted by Spurs is to turn what for many fans is a 2.5 hour experience, of which 2 hours is effectively watching the football, or the best part of 2 hours by the time you take into account half time is watching the football, into a 4 hour experience by having better concourses, by speeding up the process through which people can avail themselves of catering and other facilities, and by the increased emphasis on the prawn sandwich brigade as a fan base who will pay additional sums for additional services. The Emirates is a great stadium, but it's not the newest. And I think a lot of the things which have become seen as a norm over the course of the last decade in our broader lives, in terms of the rise of smartphones, apps and connectivity, they weren't around when the Emirates was being constructed. Also, at the time of the creation of the Emirates, banks were that much more reluctant to lend money, so Arsenal borrowed money at higher rates of interest than we're seeing with Spurs. Spurs are paying at 2.5%. That's absolute peanuts. £600 million at 2.5% is 15 million quid a year in finance costs. Well, the additional revenue that Spurs are making from the switch from the old White Hart Lane to the new stadium, that's likely to be 60 to 70 million pounds. So, and that's before you factor in using the new stadium for multifunction purposes.
On the Price of Football podcast last week, you covered Everton and spent some time talking about their proposed stadium rebuild.
Now, Everton. Growing up, and in recent years, Everton, one of those clubs you always associated with stability. But in the last couple of years, there's been a sort of rather a sea change. There's sort of posting losses of £100 million. That's a big number, isn't it?
It's certainly a sea change.
We've already mentioned the gap that exists between the top and the bottom in the Premier League in terms of matchday revenue. To what extent do you think that building a bigger and better stadium is a good way of closing that gap down financially?
To a certain extent, it's the only way that a club like Everton can go. They are hemmed in by financial fair play, so they can't necessarily keep increasing the wage bill and the transfer fee budget in the way that they have done since Farhad Moshiri took over the club. He's already stuck £350 million in terms of loans. He's paid off the existing bank loans and replaced them with interest-free loans from himself. But he cannot do that indefinitely. So therefore, he's got to look at ways of generating extra revenue for Everton. I think the challenge that he's got, because Everton's matchday income is 14 million, that's half of West Ham's, it's 1/5 of Liverpool's. So the only way he can narrow that gap is to convert Everton, which is a lovely piece of architecture. Is it fit for the 2020s from a fan matchday experience in terms of what we expect as a de minimis? So as an away fan that goes there and an away fan who is 6'3", my first challenge is, can I sit down in a seat at Goodison? No, I can't. So therefore, I stand. I mean, I would rather stand anyway. But automatically, you're getting a reaction from fans, well, therefore, that limits the amount I'm prepared to pay to go to Goodison. The prices there are great in many regards. It is a traditional working class fan base. If they want to extend that fan base to get more of the commercial market, to get more of the, what we might refer to in old words as sort of the white collar market, then they've got to be able to offer better facilities, more corporate boxes, more hospitality packages and things of that nature. And you can't do that at Goodison because it is too old, it is too hemmed in, and the footprint of the ground is too small.
What about the smaller clubs? So you're obviously a Brighton fan. You have recently had a stadium rebuild. We also talk about another South Coast team in Bournemouth who have a stadium that's too small for their purposes.
We've finally made it to the Premier League and... Oh, hang on a minute. Excuse me, mate, where's the stadium?
I don't know, mate, this is a shed.
What difference do you think the stadium makes between Brighton and Bournemouth? Is there a notable financial benefit from them?
Well, yeah, I mean, the financial benefit between those two is that Bournemouth generate £5 million a year from Matchday and Brighton's is 18. Now, that gives us a 10% overall benefit in terms of income. So Bournemouth generate £4 out of every 100 from their stadium. For Brighton, it's 13. So it does give the clubs who are all competing. There are probably about 10 clubs in the bottom half of the Premier League who have broadly similar wage budgets, but an extra £10 million in the bottom half of the league can be the difference between staying up and not staying up, provided that money is spent well. And as a Brighton fan, the jury's out as to how well we've spent our money this season. But I think if you talk to Bournemouth fans, I think some of their investments in players have also been questioned. At the rear end of the division, a couple of extra £1 million does make a difference because the average salary of players at that level is around about the £2 million a year mark. And that could mean that you can offer a little bit more money to a few more players, get them to re-sign contracts. Or if you are 3 or 4 of you chasing that player, you've got to think about what happened for Jared Bowen. He had the choice of going to 3 or 4 clubs in the Premier League, and the final decision was made on the basis of wages. Well, it's because West Ham have the 7th highest matchday income, and that allows them to outbid Crystal Palace, who thought that they'd secured the player.
So what do you think is going to be the next stage of development as clubs seek to increase their matchday revenues?
What we are finding increasingly is that the fans that come to the match, they're starting to use club Wi-Fi. Well, every time you use club Wi-Fi, you're giving away huge amounts of data to the Wi-Fi providers, especially the clubs themselves. And I think what we will find is over the course of the next decade, that data becomes the new oil. It becomes one of the most valuable commodities on the planet. And the more people you've got in, the more data you can get out of them. And therefore, actually having a bigger stadium allows you to sell on that data or to mine that data to a greater extent than your peer group.
can read Liam Twomey's coverage of Chelsea Football Club at The Athletic. Kieran Maguire is a football finance expert working at Liverpool University, co-host of the Price of Football podcast, and author of the recent book, The Price of Football. This podcast is produced by Josh Schneiderweiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today. If you enjoy this podcast, why not rate and review it on iTunes, or share an episode with a friend. See you next time.